Lucas, an 18-year-old with striking good looks, worked at Mrs. Elena's mansion. His job included cleaning, gardening, and taking care of the vast property. He was always dedicated to his work, tirelessly willing to help with any task, even if it wasn't part of his duties. Mrs. Elena, a 60-year-old woman, was charmed by Lucas's kindness and helpfulness. He was always available, never complained about working extra hours, and was always ready to assist her with any request. Impressed and attracted to the young man's personality and appearance, Mrs. Elena started showing a more personal interest in him. She invited him to intimate dinners at the mansion, pleasant walks around the city, and even luxurious trips. Lucas, always polite and eager, accepted all invitations, accompanying Mrs. Elena with a genuine smile and impeccable behavior. This strengthened the bond between them. Mrs. Elena's attention towards Lucas became more evident. During a candlelit dinner, with a selection of sophisticated dishes, she made a flattering comment about his appearance, gently touching his hand. Lucas, initially surprised, smiled politely but was left thoughtful. Mrs. Elena's intentions were becoming clear, and he began to consider the opportunities this could bring. The next day, while tending to the garden, Lucas reflected on his life. Coming from a humble family, he always looked for ways to improve his situation and help his parents. Working at the mansion was already a blessing, but Mrs. Elena's attention could open even bigger doors. He knew she had significant influence in society, and a close relationship with her could lead to unique opportunities. That night after dinner, Mrs. Elena invited him for a glass of wine. They sat on the terrace enjoying the night breeze. She started talking about her life, her loneliness, and how rejuvenated she felt in his presence. Their eyes met, and Mrs. Elena, with a gentle gesture, touched Lucas's face, leaning in for a kiss. Lucas hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision, but the unspoken promises of a better life, the opportunities, and the genuine affection Mrs. Elena showed ended up prevailing. He gave in and kissed her back, beginning a romance that quickly intensified. In the following days, Lucas and Mrs. Elena began sharing even more intimate moments. He started receiving expensive gifts, like designer clothes and a luxury watch. Trips became more frequent, with exotic destinations and stays in five-star hotels. Despite the age difference, Lucas felt comfortable beside Mrs. Elena, and she seemed to relive her lost youth. Their relationship began to attract the attention of others, employees and society around them. Comments and whispers were inevitable, but Mrs. Elena, with her confident and firm stance, didn't worry about other people's opinions. To her, Lucas was more than just an attractive young man. He was a companion who filled a void she had felt for a long time. Lucas, on his part, started feeling more confident and secure. He knew that beside Mrs. Elena, he would have a bright future. However, he was also aware that eventually, he would need to decide what he truly wanted for his life. But for now, he was willing to take advantage of the opportunities and the company of the woman who had welcomed and elevated him to a new level. One night, while lying in the spacious mahogany bed in the mansion's master bedroom, Mrs. Elena started talking about her past. She told Lucas that despite all her possessions and success, she had never married. Her financial and social achievements didn't fill the void left by the absence of her own family. "I was always very focused on my business," she confessed, her eyes filled with emotion, "and I ended up putting my personal life aside. But Lucas, you have brought a new joy into my life. With you, I feel something I've never felt before, and now I realize that there's still something I deeply desire." Lucas listened intently, capturing every word. Then, holding his hand firmly, Mrs. Elena made the proposal that would change everything. "Marry me, Lucas. I know this might seem unexpected, but it's my dream. I want to spend the last years of my life with someone I love and trust, and if you accept, my inheritance will be yours. Everything I have will be yours, no exceptions." Lucas was surprised. Although he knew his relationship with Mrs. Elena was evolving, he hadn't expected a marriage proposal, let alone one with such a generous inheritance promise. He began thinking about the financial aspect. The idea of inheriting all of Mrs. Elena's fortune was tempting. He knew she didn't have many years left, and this opportunity could secure the future he had always desired, not just for himself, but for his family too. He weighed his options for a few moments of silence. Mrs. Elena observing his face, anxious for his answer. Finally, Lucas decided that, although he hadn't initially imagined this path for himself, the advantages were irresistible. With a gentle smile, he looked into Mrs. Elena's eyes and answered, "I accept, Elena. I want to be by your side, and I'll do everything I can to make you happy." Mrs. Elena's happiness was palpable. She hugged him tightly, tears now flowing freely down her face. Preparations for the wedding began immediately. She spared no expense, wanting the event to be grand and unforgettable. The wedding was a luxurious ceremony held in the mansion's lush gardens. Mrs. Elena's friends and important figures from society attended, witnessing the improbable but deeply sentimental union between the wealthy widow and the young employee. Over time, Lucas got used to his new life of comfort and privilege. He continued to care for Mrs. Elena with affection and respect, knowing his future was secure. Mrs. Elena, for her part, lived her days with renewed happiness, grateful to have found love and companionship in the last years of her life. After the marriage, Lucas's life at Mrs. Elena's mansion seemed to have reached a new level of luxury and comfort. However, over time, he began noticing changes in the behavior of those around him. The mansion's employees, in front of their colleagues and friends, started making sarcastic comments and giving him looks of disdain. Jokes about the young man who married for money were made behind his back. Lucas managed to hear some of the whispers. During a lunch at the mansion, one of the gardeners, feigning innocence, commented, "Lucas never had anyone rise so fast in life. Must be a special skill." The barely concealed laughter of those present made Lucas feel a knot in his chest. The situation worsened when he began attending social events with Mrs. Elena. Her friends, many of whom had children the same age as Lucas, made veiled comments and asked indiscreet questions about his true intentions. They often insinuated that Lucas was only waiting to inherit Mrs. Elena's fortune. Even Lucas's own family wasn't immune to the rumors. When he visited his parents hoping to share the happiness and advantages of his new lifestyle, he was met with disapproving looks. His mother, always direct, asked, "Lucas, do you truly love this woman, or are you just with her for the money?" His father, although more reserved, couldn't hide the discomfort and worry about his son's choices. These comments and attitudes began to affect Lucas deeply. He found himself reflecting late at night on his choices. The marriage, which seemed like a solution to all his financial problems, now carried an emotional weight he hadn't anticipated. The constant laughter and criticism left him increasingly sad and insecure. One night, while they were in the mansion's drawing room, Mrs. Elena noticed his dejection. "Lucas, you seem distant. Is something bothering you?" she asked, her tone filled with genuine concern. Lucas hesitated but finally confided in her. "Elena, it's not you. I respect you and care deeply about you, but the comments, the jokes, are affecting me. People think I'm only with you for the money. Even my family has started to doubt me." Mrs. Elena listened attentively, her face marked with sadness. "Lucas, I know our union is unusual, but I believe in our relationship. People will always talk, no matter what we do. What matters is how we feel about each other." Despite Mrs. Elena's comforting words, Lucas couldn't shake the doubts and sadness he felt. He knew he needed to find a way to deal with the criticism and decide what he truly wanted for his future. Money and comfort, while important, were proving insufficient to bring the peace and happiness he craved. A few weeks after the marriage, Mrs. Elena's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Initially, it was just small signs of tiredness and discomfort, but soon they evolved into episodes of severe weakness and fainting. Worried about her worsening condition, Mrs. Elena was admitted to the hospital. The doctors diagnosed a serious condition, and despite all their efforts, Mrs. Elena ended up in a coma. Devastated by the news, Lucas spent most of his time by her side at the hospital, trying to stay strong while dealing with the anguish and uncertainty. During this period, Lucas stumbled upon an unexpected situation. While organizing some of Mrs. Elena's personal documents, he found papers and financial records that indicated irregularities. Intrigued and worried, he decided to investigate further. What he discovered was surprising and disturbing. Lucas found out that a significant portion of Mrs. Elena's fortune came from illegal and shady activities. The evidence suggested her involvement in corruption schemes, money laundering, and even ties to criminal organizations. The investigations revealed suspicious financial transactions and shady contracts linking Mrs. Elena's wealth to a network of illicit practices. With the discovery of the illegal activities, Lucas felt even more distressed. He found himself caught in a moral dilemma. The money he had received and was still hoping to inherit was tainted by crimes and injustices. The weight of future decisions and the fear of potential legal and social repercussions were consuming him. Desperate and confused, Lucas sought out a trusted lawyer for guidance on what to do. The lawyer confirmed the seriousness of the discoveries and advised Lucas to be cautious of any action that could implicate him in criminal activities. Lucas spent the night awake, debating whether he should reveal the truth about the sources of Mrs. Elena's fortune or continue with his initial plan to inherit the wealth and face the consequences. Mrs. Elena's presence in a coma made the situation even more complex, as he had no one to turn to discuss his discoveries and get direct guidance. As time passed, the anguish and weight of responsibility accumulated on Lucas. He was determined to do the right thing, but also worried about the impact of his actions on Mrs. Elena's life in a coma and on his own future prospects. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and Lucas knew he needed to make crucial decisions that could change not only his future, but also the fate of everyone involved. One night, while Lucas was sleeping in the mansion, he was abruptly awakened by a deafening noise. Amidst the darkness of the room, 4 hooded men burst into the place. They were aggressive, dressed in dark clothes that concealed their identities. Lucas, frightened and confused, tried to react. But before he could understand what was happening, one of the men grabbed him and forced him to stand up. "Where's the safe?" one of the men demanded, his voice grave and menacing. "We know Elena had a safe hidden. Where is it, Lucas?" Stunned and with his heart racing, Lucas tried to regain his composure. I don't know what you're talking about. There's no safe here." The men didn't seem convinced. They started to search the room brutally, knocking down furniture and rummaging through drawers. Lucas, with his fear increasing, tried to calmly explain that although he had access to many documents, he had no knowledge of any safe or hidden vault. One of the men, showing impatience, raised his voice. "Don't waste our time. We know Elena's fortune has something hidden. If you don't show us where it is, the consequences will be severe." Lucas realized the situation was becoming dangerous. He knew he was at a disadvantage without Mrs. Elena's help. He tried to use the only advantage he had, his partial knowledge of the documents he had found. "I can try to help you find what you're looking for, but you need to give me time and let me explain. I'll lead you to the documents." With some reluctance, the men allowed Lucas to get up and followed him to the office. There, Lucas started to show them the documents he had previously found, attempting to direct their search towards the areas where he believed the information about the safe might be. However, his intention was to gain time and find out more about who was behind the threat. While the men examined the documents, Lucas realized they were becoming increasingly frustrated. He took advantage of that moment to try to make a discreet call to the police, but was interrupted before he could complete the call. Finally, after a long and agonizing search, the men, apparently not finding what they were looking for, prepared to leave the mansion. But before they left, one of the men made a final threat. "If you try to deceive us again, or if you don't find the safe, there will be consequences. Remember, we're always watching." With that, the men left the mansion, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Lucas, still trembling and dazed, collapsed to the floor, trying to process what had happened. He knew his situation was now even more dangerous and complicated. The threats of the intruders and the imminent need to deal with the legal and moral implications of Mrs. Elena's fortune left him in a state of despair and uncertainty. Determined to protect himself and resolve the situation, Lucas knew he needed to act quickly. He planned to seek professional help to protect himself and uncover the truth about Mrs. Elena's fortune while trying to find a solution that would ensure his safety and face the threats that now loomed over him. After the violent incident at the mansion, Lucas continued to be on constant alert, trying to deal with the insecurity and the growing sense of danger. However, the situation worsened when Mrs. Elena died a few weeks later, without regaining consciousness. Her death left Lucas in a state of shock and sadness, besides intensifying his concerns about the future. During the mourning process and the organization of Mrs. Elena's final affairs, the lawyers announced that Lucas was the heir to her entire fortune. This was widely publicized and received with mixed reactions, with many questioning the legitimacy of the situation, especially after the rumors about the illicit practices associated with the fortune. Lucas, now officially declared the heir, began to deal with the complex legal and financial issues that came with the inheritance. However, the surprise and concern increased when a new development emerged. A month after Mrs. Elena's death, a new revelation was made during the reading of her final will. It became clear that Mrs. Elena had left a secret will, discovered among her personal documents. The will, dated a few years earlier, revealed that the entire fortune would be destined for Mrs. Elena's children, whose existence had been kept secret. The children, whose identities and information were hidden until then, were in fact the legal heirs to the fortune. The revelation was a shock for Lucas. Not only had he believed that the fortune would be his, but also Mrs. Elena's children were now a crucial part of this new reality. The news about the secret will was widely publicized, and Mrs. Elena's children, who were in different places and in various living conditions, were now in the spotlight. Lucas found himself in a new and complicated situation. Mrs. Elena's children, who had unexpectedly come to light, started to claim their rights to the inheritance. They were people with diverse backgrounds and circumstances, and some seemed determined to legally fight for their share of the fortune. Lucas, now confused and disoriented, tried to contact Mrs. Elena's children to understand their intentions and find a way to resolve the situation fairly. He knew that facing a prolonged litigation would be grueling and that his dream of a comfortable life could be at risk. While trying to negotiate and reach an agreement with the heirs, Lucas began to reflect on his own choices and actions. He was determined to find a solution that was ethical and just, even if it meant giving up some of his own interests. The situation was becoming increasingly complex, and Lucas understood that his true battle was not just for the fortune, but for his own integrity and peace of mind. The announcement of the secret will brought a whirlwind of changes for Lucas. The children of Mrs. Elena, upon learning of the inheritance, began to engage in a complex and prolonged litigation, each of them claiming a significant portion of the fortune. Legal disputes became intense. Court hearings were exhausting, and Lucas found himself caught in a labyrinth of legal documents and legal strategies. As the judicial process dragged on, Lucas faced a new and grave problem. A few days after the disputes began, the four hooded men returned to the mansion. This time they didn't come looking for a safe, but to deliver a terrifying message. With an implacable tone, one of them declared, "Mrs. Elena left a debt of $10 million. If you don't pay that debt, there will be serious consequences. Considering your current position, you are responsible for settling this obligation." Lucas was shocked. He had no idea about the existence of such a debt, let alone its origin. The additional information made the situation even more serious. Besides the litigation with Mrs. Elena's children and the uncertainty about the future, he now faced a direct and imminent threat to his safety and financial stability. Desperate, Lucas sought the help of a lawyer specialized in financial and legal matters. The lawyer confirmed that Mrs. Elena did indeed have substantial debts, many of which were linked to her illegal activities. The situation was further complicated because the debt wasn't officially registered, but according to the hooded men, it was a commitment that needed to be paid immediately to avoid retaliation. With fear increasing and few options, Lucas began to try to negotiate with the creditors to obtain a longer payment deadline. He also contacted Mrs. Elena's children, seeking to reach an agreement to reduce the disputes and possibly obtain some kind of deal that could alleviate the financial burden. While facing these battles, Lucas felt increasingly isolated and stressed. The pressure was immense, and he felt cornered on all sides. He had to deal with the financial demands of the hooded men, the legal demands of Mrs. Elena's children, and the constant sense of insecurity that weighed heavily on his life. The situation reached a critical point when the hooded men made new threats, making it clear that they were ready to act if the debt wasn't paid soon. Lucas knew that to protect himself and find a solution, he desperately needed a solid strategy and possibly a way to uncover the true nature of the debt and how it could be resolved. After weeks of intense and stressful legal battles, the court finally reached a decision. Mrs. Elena's children received 80% of the fortune, while Lucas was left with only 20%, which amounted to a total of $15 million. The decision was a blow to Lucas, who had expected a larger share of the inheritance to manage his debts and secure his future. Frustration and anger took over Lucas upon hearing the verdict. He confronted Mrs. Elena's children in front of the court, accusing them of being greedy and not understanding the pressure he was under. The argument quickly escalated, resulting in a physical fight that drew the attention of everyone present. The police intervened quickly, separating Lucas and Mrs. Elena's children while officers calmed the situation. Lucas, still agitated and visibly disturbed, vented his anguish. "They don't understand. I have a huge debt. There are 4 men after me, threatening my life if I don't pay $10 million. All this is because of Elena's illegal activities." The police were alarmed by Lucas's revelation. They took him to a quieter area to get more information about the threats. Lucas recounted everything he knew about the hooded men, the threats he had received, and the debt left by Mrs. Elena. The officers promised to investigate the case and provided Lucas with temporary protection while they continued their investigations. Although Lucas remained furious and frustrated with the court's decision, he felt a small relief knowing that the police were aware of the situation and that there might be some kind of protection against the men threatening him. With the court's final decision and the established police protection, Lucas found himself in a period of great uncertainty and loneliness. His family, who had never approved of his marriage to Mrs. Elena, had become even more distant after the dramatic events. They weren't willing to support him in such a critical moment, and Lucas felt completely isolated. The lack of family support weighed even heavier on him, adding to his financial responsibilities and the constant fear of the hooded men's threats. Without the presence of his loved ones and with a future that seemed uncertain, Lucas began to feel lost and overwhelmed. The police investigation was progressing slowly. The officers, informed by Lucas about the hooded men's threats, were dedicated to locating and capturing those responsible. They gathered information from Lucas's statements, analyzed financial records, and conducted a more detailed search into the origin of Mrs. Elena's debt. The police identified some initial clues that could lead to the identification of the hooded men, such as details about the vehicles they used and the location of suspicious meetings. However, the process was complex, and the men were well hidden, making the authorities' task difficult. Meanwhile, Lucas tried to focus on his own survival and recovery. With the money he still had, he sought financial advice and started reorganizing his life. He decided to invest in personal security and preventative measures to protect himself against any possible retaliation from the creditors. Lucas also considered the possibility of moving to a new city or even another country if necessary to guarantee his safety. He consulted with security specialists and explored relocation options that could offer him a new opportunity to start over, far from the threats and stigma surrounding him. However, even with these precautions, Lucas couldn't shake off the feeling of anxiety and helplessness. Every day, he anxiously awaited news from the police about the investigation's progress. The uncertainty about the future and the feeling of being constantly in the sights of dangerous people weighed heavily on his mind. In a moment of deep reflection, Lucas decided to try to restore some level of normalcy to his life. He started to get involved in activities that distracted him and helped him regain a sense of purpose. He invested in personal projects and looked for ways to connect with the community, hoping to find support and rebuild his life. The process of facing the debt, the threats, and the lack of family support became a daily challenge for Lucas. But despite the difficulties, he continued to fight to find a way out and rebuild his life, determined not to let adversity define him. With the police investigation advancing, the authorities decided that the best strategy for capturing the hooded men was to organize an ambush. They developed a meticulous plan to lure the creditors to a place where they could be safely apprehended. To execute the plan, the police needed Lucas to act as bait. He was instructed to contact one of the hooded men and arrange a meeting, pretending to be willing to pay the debt. Lucas, despite his fear, agreed to participate in the plan, knowing it was his best chance to resolve the situation and guarantee his safety with the help of the police. He called one of the men, whom he identified as the group's leader, and arranged a meeting at the mansion, claiming he was ready to deliver the $10 million as agreed. The police prepared a covert operation to ensure everything went smoothly. On the day of the meeting, the mansion was discreetly surrounded by police officers. They positioned themselves in strategic locations, ready to act as soon as the hooded men arrived. Lucas was nervous but determined to follow the plan. He hoped that by handing over the money and capturing the men, he could finally start rebuilding his life without the constant threat that loomed over him. As the time of the meeting approached, Lucas did his best to stay calm and avoid raising suspicions. He prepared an area in the mansion where the money was to be delivered, as instructed by the hooded men. The space was carefully arranged to appear legitimate and not arouse distrust. When the hooded men arrived, Lucas greeted them with feigned relief. They were cautious but seemed satisfied to see the money. As the men began to count the amount, the police remained hidden, observing every move closely. At the right moment, the officers gave the signal and surrounded the hooded men. The operation was quick and efficient. The men were caught by surprise and apprehended without significant resistance. Lucas watched from a distance, his heart racing with a mix of relief and adrenaline. After the capture, the police officers took the hooded men to the station, where they were formally charged with extortion and other criminal activities. The police also began to investigate further into the illegal activities related to Mrs. Elena's debt, hoping to uncover more information about the network of crimes. With the creditors out of the picture and in custody, Lucas finally began to feel a sense of relief. Although he still had to face the consequences of the litigation with Mrs. Elena's children and the financial repercussions, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Lucas took the opportunity to reconnect with his lawyers and seek solutions for his financial problems. With the threat of violence eliminated, he began to focus on finding a way to resolve the remaining legal and financial issues. The police operation also brought a new level of hope for Lucas. He felt that despite the immense challenges he had faced, there was a path to recovery and an opportunity to rebuild his life with more security and stability. The experience had been a painful ordeal, but it was also a chance to change the course of his life and seek a better future. After the capture of the hooded men and the relief of the immediate threat, Lucas felt a deep need to seek reconciliation with his family. He knew he had made questionable decisions, and the distance between him and his loved ones had been exacerbated by the tumultuous situation. Determined to seek understanding and perhaps some peace, he decided to go after his family to explain his situation and the reasons behind his actions. Lucas located his family, who lived in a small town a few hours away. His visit was marked by a mix of apprehension and hope. He knew that regaining their trust wouldn't be easy, but he felt he needed to try, especially after the traumatic experience he had lived through. When Lucas arrived at his parents' house, he was greeted with a mix of surprise and discomfort. His parents, although hesitant, agreed to listen to what he had to say. They gathered in the living room, and Lucas began to speak with sincerity about everything that had happened. "I know you didn't agree with my marriage to Mrs. Elena, and that my decision hurt you," Lucas began, his voice filled with emotion. "But I needed you to know the truth about what really happened. I married her not just for the fortune, but because I was facing a desperate situation." Lucas explained how he met Mrs. Elena, his attempt to find a financial way out, and the pressure he faced to ensure a secure future. He spoke about Mrs. Elena's influence, the challenges he faced dealing with the debt, and the threats of the hooded men. He explained how those events led him to make difficult decisions. "I never wanted to cause you problems," Lucas continued. "I was desperate and didn't know who else to turn to. The pressure to guarantee financial security and face the constant threat of the creditors made me make decisions that I now see as wrong. I regret not seeking your help before." His parents listened intently, and Lucas's honesty began to touch their hearts. They understood the complexity of the situation and the difficulty he had faced. Although there was still pain and disappointment, Lucas's openness began to open a path towards reconciliation. After the conversation, his parents expressed their desire to help Lucas overcome the challenges he still faced. They understood he had been through an immense ordeal and were willing to give him a second chance. Forgiveness wasn't immediate, but the willingness to listen and understand was an important step. Lucas also apologized for his absence and the decisions he had made, promising to work to rebuild trust and restore family ties. The conversation didn't solve all the problems. It wasn't immediate, but it was a start for healing and understanding. With the renewed support of his family, Lucas started to face the remaining challenges with a different perspective. He continued to work on resolving the pending financial and legal matters and dedicated himself to rebuilding his life in a more balanced and honest way. The experience of seeking reconciliation and understanding from his family gave Lucas a new perspective on the value of relationships and the importance of facing problems with integrity. With their support and the lesson learned, Lucas was determined to move forward, seeking a more stable and positive future. After reconciling with his family, Lucas decided that the best way to move forward and offer a better future for everyone was to move into Mrs. Elena's mansion, which he had now inherited. The large house, which had once seemed a symbol of his problems and challenges, now represented a new opportunity to start over. Moving into the mansion brought a sense of renewal and hope for Lucas's family. His mother, who had worked tirelessly as a cleaner to support the family, could now rest and enjoy a little more comfort and security. His siblings, who had previously faced difficulties accessing a quality education, had the opportunity to attend a reputable school, something that had always been a dream for them. Lucas began to focus on his true passion: medicine. Since he was young, he had dreamed of becoming a doctor, but circumstances and responsibilities had diverted him from that path. Now, with the financial stability provided by the inheritance and the support of his family, he decided to finally follow that dream. He enrolled in a prestigious university where he began to study with determination to become a doctor. The academic challenges were significant, but Lucas was motivated by the idea of building a career that not only provided him with personal fulfillment, but also allowed him to help others, something that had always been important to him. Lucas's family quickly adapted to the new life in the mansion. His mother dedicated her time to hobbies and activities she had always wanted to do, while his siblings, now in a high-quality school, excelled in their studies and began to develop their own dreams and aspirations. Lucas also dedicated time to getting involved in the local community, using his experience and resources to support health and education initiatives, contributing to causes he considered important. The difficult experience he had gone through made him more empathetic and determined to make a difference in the lives of those around him. Although Lucas's path had been filled with challenges and difficulties, he found a new perspective and purpose. Mrs. Elena's mansion, now a symbol of rebirth and new opportunities, became the setting for building a fuller and more meaningful life. With the support of his family and his determination to follow his dream of being a doctor, Lucas was ready to face any challenge and build a better future for himself and those he loved. While Lucas and his family began to enjoy the new stability and happiness in their lives, the situation of the hooded men in prison was far from resolved. Now in custody, they were furious and thirsty for revenge, feeling cornered and without options. They decided to use their connections to get revenge on Lucas and reclaim what they considered their right. Inside the prison, the hooded men managed to establish communication with a dangerous gang operating outside the walls of the institution. They made agreements and offered information and money in exchange for help to locate and attack Lucas. The gang, known for its violent activities and ability to act discreetly, accepted the challenge, attracted by the potential for profit and the opportunity to cause chaos. The gang leaders began to devise a plan to find and confront Lucas, using their networks of contacts and resources to obtain information about his new life in the mansion and the family's routine. The plan included infiltration and espionage, with the goal of finding Lucas's weakness and vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Lucas, unaware of the new threat approaching, continued to build his new life. His studies in medicine were going well, and he was starting to make friends and connections at the university. His family was finally enjoying a quiet and comfortable life, without the worries that had dominated their previous years. However, the gang didn't take long to obtain information about the mansion and Lucas's routine. They began to conduct surveillance around the property, observing his movements and seeking the best way to carry out their operation. The gang planned a swift and effective attack, aiming to capture Lucas and force him to pay a ransom or face severe consequences. One day, while Lucas was studying for his exams, he began to feel an increasing sense of unease. Small incidents and details started to catch his attention: suspicious noises and the feeling of being watched. He began to worry and decided to report his concerns to the police, who were aware of the situation and continued to monitor for potential threats. The officers, conscious of the potential danger, intensified surveillance around the mansion and reinforced security measures. They conducted more frequent patrols, installed additional monitoring equipment, and ensured the protection of Lucas and his family. The goal was to prevent any attempt at invasion and ensure that if the gang tried to act, the police would be ready to intervene. Meanwhile, the gang continued to prepare their attack, determined to go ahead with the plan, believing that capturing Lucas could guarantee a great return and bring a sense of revenge. The tension was rising, and the climate of insecurity began to affect everyone in the mansion. Lucas and his family, aware that something was wrong, tried to stay calm and continue with their lives. However, the constant threat and the need to be on alert began to affect their sense of security and well-being. With the gang's plan in motion and the police preparing for any eventuality, the situation was about to reach a critical point. The battle for the safety and stability of Lucas and his family was far from over, and the next phase of this conflict promised to be the most challenging of all. With the security of the mansion reinforced and the constant presence of over 20 heavily armed police officers and guards, the gang never managed to carry out their plan of attack. The protective measures prevented any attempt at invasion, and the gang was forced to withdraw, frustrated and without achieving their objectives. The threat of violence that hung over Lucas and his family was neutralized, but the psychological impact of the situation continued to mark their lives. Despite the physical protection provided by the authorities, the atmosphere in the mansion became tense and charged with fear. Lucas and his family lived almost in complete isolation, rarely leaving the property. The constant feeling of being under threat made them increasingly reclusive, limiting their activities to what was strictly necessary. The following years were a difficult period of adaptation. The constant vigilance and fear of an imminent attack transformed the mansion into a security fortress, but also into an emotional prison for its occupants. Although safety was guaranteed, the cost was high, a life marked by anxiety and fear. Lucas, who had dreamed of a life of success and professional fulfillment as a doctor, managed to find his professional path, but the constant surveillance and fear of a new attack deeply affected his quality of life. He had to balance his career and his desire to help others with the need to keep his family safe and the feeling of always being on alert. Lucas's family also suffered with the change in their lifestyle. The freedom and joy they hoped to experience by moving to the mansion were overshadowed by constant fear and a sense of confinement. Although they were physically safe, the emotional impact was profound. The end of Lucas's story and his family illustrates the complexities and high costs involved in decisions made under pressure and in search of financial security. The protection offered by Mrs. Elena's inheritance brought security against immediate threats, but it also created an environment of fear and isolation that had a significant impact on their lives. Thus, Lucas's story raises questions about the choices made for financial reasons and the consequences of those decisions. The pursuit of security and success can sometimes come at a high price, and true happiness can be challenged by external and internal factors. Now, with the outcome of the story, the reflection remains. Do you think Lucas got the ending he deserved? How did he handle the consequences of his decisions? Share your opinions in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Until next time.